January the 14th, 2011, Avenue Bourguiba, Tunis. In the impressive crowd that has assembled, we can make out a banner and two Tunisian flags. If we look closer, we can see a few placards, including this one, "Game over." Written in English, this message is directed at the international media. And here's what's happening in an adjacent street. A group brandishing a portrait of the revolutionary Che Guevara is heading for Avenue Bourguiba. In another street, another group, this time bearing no distinctive signs, is about to burst through the cordon of plainclothes policemen to join the central avenue of Tunis. You are witnessing the very first mass demonstration in the Tunisian capital since the unrest began. A very diverse crowd, then, gathered to demand the overthrow of the dictator and to tell the whole world about it. An uprising is always born of a sudden and unpredictable event. If the mutiny does not abate, the government must do its utmost to prevent the uprising from spreading to the rest of the country. Because once that threshold has been crossed, those in power will struggle to cling on. Paris, May 1968. After a totally unforeseen riot outside the Sorbonne, the students have occupied the Latin Quarter for the past week. During the night, clashes with the police have culminated in the erection of barricades. The whole country is taken aback by the violence.
It was put down to a simmering discontent among young people. They were misunderstood, we should make more effort to understand them, etc. All of which was very probably true. There are always problems that need to be addressed, but the striking thing was how violently and quickly the protests grew. Within a week, Paris was in pandemonium.
The government was being overwhelmed by these unprecedented student protests. Repressive measures were not only ineffectual, they served to inflame the situation. May the 11th, 1968, Prime Minister Pompidou, absent since the beginning of the crisis, returns from a diplomatic trip.
He'd written his speech during the flight. So he headed straight off to meet de Gaulle and convince him to change tack and do the opposite of what had been done so far. That's to say, to reopen the Sorbonne and let the courts deal with the students who had been arrested during the night of rioting.
J'ai décidé que la Sorbonne serait librement rouverte à partir de lundi, les cours reprenant à la diligence du recteur et des doyens. À partir de lundi, également, la Cour d'appel pourra, conformément à la loi, statuer sur les demandes de libération des étudiants condamnés.
The Prime Minister reacts in the traditional way. Repressive measures having failed, he makes concessions to ease tensions.
At that point, we hoped things would be sorted out.
But here's what the factories have been saying for the last few days.
Il est sûr et certain que ça a sensibilisé l'opinion publique. Ça c'est sûr et certain. La classe ouvrière, après tout, les matraques, elle les connaît. Quand j'ai été manifester, je vais pas manifester. Quand je vais manifester, qu'on a des gardes mobiles ou des CRS en face de nous, alors on les connaît, quoi. On les connaît. Alors il est sûr et certain qu'on apprécie à leur juste valeur ce qu'ils ont fait.
On the shop floor, industrial action was brewing in defiance of union orders. The same phenomena would be seen in every factory. The trade unions, whose job it was to organize and supervise industrial action, were being overwhelmed by their members' unrest. They were forced into action in the hope of seizing control of a situation that was getting out of hand.
Yes, the idea was to maintain control or seize control of the protests. So we did what we always did. We organized a mass demonstration, which was even more successful than we'd hoped. The turnout was impressive, 600,000, 800,000, maybe 1 million. No matter. It was a huge demonstration that went on all afternoon.
But the mass demonstration of May the 13th failed to give the unions control of the situation.
Starting Tuesday, the CGT was faced with a protest that it could no longer control in its own sector. It wasn't just about universities or students. It had extended to the private and public business sectors.
The following day, Tuesday, May the 14th, 1,800 workers at Sud Aviation in Nantes came out on strike and occupied the factory. This triggered a wave of sit-in strikes. 2 days later, on May the 16th, in an attempt to regain some measure of control, the CGT trade union called a strike at Renault's Billancourt factory, the industrial barometer of the country.
Et en fait, quand je suis arrivée ici, tout le monde sortait de tous les coins. Je suis arrivée au bureau syndical, tout le monde était un peu dépassé par tous ces gens-là qui sortaient. Oui. C'était vachement vite et c'était un peu surprenant. Personne ne s'y attendait tellement.
The epicenter of the May 68 protests had moved from the university to the factories, to big businesses in France.
Dans les grandes entreprises françaises que ça se passe.
And at the time, there were a lot of them.
Un mouvement social se constitue.
This wave of industrial action grew, and it was backed by millions. It wasn't just the usual few thousand activists taking to the streets. A huge section of the population was involved.
On avait marre, on savait pas exactement, on n'avait pas encore établi exactement pourquoi on voulait occuper l'usine, mais on voulait l'occuper et tout le monde voulait l'occuper.
Et on n'avait jamais rien obtenu jusqu'à présent. On a dit, bon ben, il y a une action étudiante, on va essayer de coopérer avec eux et de faire quelque chose.
It mattered little that workers and students didn't share the same grievances. The success of one section of the community triggered in others an overwhelming desire to take action.
They thought, why not us too? Come on, lads. In a way, it was what we wanted, but we didn't see it coming. It was a bolt from the blue.
Within a few days, the uprising had gone from 1,000 or so protesting students to 10 million workers coming out on strike. Employees, managers, civil servants, not to mention farmers and fishermen. Every social category joined in the action. The entire population became involved. By clashing violently with the police over a one-week period, the students changed the perception of what was possible in French society in 1968. Everyone saw an opportunity to make their own demands. The sheer speed of this overpowering phenomenon caught all those involved, the state, the trade unions and the political parties, on the hop. Like everyone else, the government was shaken by events. Despite the concessions made by the Prime Minister, the unrest escalated with disconcerting rapidity. Beijing, April 1989. In the wake of the death of reformist leader Hu Yaobang, the students staged a 2-week demonstration. They wanted political reforms and dialogue with the authorities, who reacted in the form of a threatening editorial in the People's Daily.
At first, the students were pretty relaxed, but that scathing editorial really got them mad. It's fair to say that from that day on, the students and the government were at loggerheads.
Why was the April 26th editorial so bad? Deng Xiaoping had asked the People's Daily to report a party meeting, word for word. Not daring to disobey, the People's Daily did exactly that, publishing verbatim the loutish words of Communist Party officials. Regardless of the style, the threatening tone was perfectly blunt.
The editorial dubbed the students anti-patriotic and anti-socialist. These serious allegations carried the threat of imprisonment and maybe even execution for anyone daring to take part in the new demonstrations. It was a typical reaction from the Chinese powers. The last student protest 3 years earlier had been dealt with in a similar manner.
In that situation, the students were unanimous in deciding to fight. They agreed to tackle the threat head-on. They wrote their last will and testament and headed out from the campus.
Thursday, April the 27th, 1989. Shocked and humiliated and with fear in their bellies, the students make their way to Tiananmen Square, the political heart of the country, to chant their slogans. Surprise number one, the students were warmly encouraged along their way by the people of Beijing. Surprise number two, the numbers swelled the closer they got to Tiananmen Square. Surprise number three, the students crossed the first police roadblock with disconcerting ease.
We left the campus and broke through the police barricades, one after the other. There were around 100,000 of us on the streets that day, with possibly millions of inhabitants of Beijing lining the streets to cheer us on. I believe that that moment triggered a psychological change.
The previous day, the government had banned the demonstration, and yet 24 hours later, everyone had taken to the street.
The anxieties generated by the clampdown announced in the editorial published the previous day had given way to feelings of euphoria and power. There was also a radical change of perception, which all of China was witness to.
We had successfully turned the tables on an authoritarian government. They had threatened us to try and scare us, and our response took them by surprise. As a result, they were unsure what to do next.
So we organized other activities, including sit-ins, demonstrations, and a petition. We wanted the government to hear us out, but they didn't respond at all.
After this enormous success, the challenge for the student leaders now was to maintain the protests for the following 2 weeks, until Gorbachev's scheduled official visit to Beijing. But some students quickly became bored and began to return to classes. That was when the student leaders had an idea that would score a direct hit on the government and force it to react.
We kept talking about it, and then Wu Kai-chi and I, along with the others, decided to take more radical action and start a hunger strike.
A hunger strike. For the students, it was a completely new kind of action. It was also guaranteed to shock and horrify the Chinese, for whom the refusal of food was unthinkable. The hunger strikers elected to identify themselves by wearing a white headband. By basing themselves in Tiananmen Square, they attracted the curiosity of tens of thousands of Beijing residents who duly supported them.
Then tens of thousands of people in Beijing, at the roadside, in the streets, silently accompanied us into Tiananmen Square. It was just, we were ready to die.
I couldn't believe how many people joined us. We didn't, or at least I didn't, expect that at all.
The phenomenon took everyone by surprise. The hunger strikers had triggered a sudden and unprecedented protest. Within 3 days, more than 500,000 people occupied Tiananmen Square. Not only would Tiananmen Square be permanently occupied thereafter, the Chinese government was about to suffer a diplomatic humiliation while the whole world looked on. On May the 15th, when Gorbachev began his visit, officials were forced to organize improbable detours to ensure he avoided the student protests at all costs. Due to their lack of experience in hunger strikes, the students started to pass out, one after the other. The unnerving sound of ambulance sirens rang around Tiananmen Square. The Chinese people were horrified by the images broadcast on television. Hundreds of thousands of students hurried to Beijing from the provinces to support their comrades. In Shanghai, 500 students joined the hunger strike. Demonstrations were held in more than 200 Chinese cities. Workers too joined the protest, and for the first time, the factories ground to a halt. Every category of worker was now involved. By May the 18th, 1 million people were occupying Tiananmen Square. And thus, by creating upheaval with their hunger strike and smart use of the international media, the students of Beijing managed to extend their protest throughout the length and breadth of the country. Iran, 1978. Further to a newspaper article offending Ayatollah Khomeini, a religious leader in exile, the Shiite clergy began a revolt against the Shah. This uprising would unfold in a cycle that repeated itself every 40 days, on the occasion of the ritual celebration of the martyrs of repression. The religious action tried hard to rally other sectors of society to their cause, to no avail. By the end of the 6th 40-day cycle, that's to say after 8 months of revolt, the religious faction's protest was running out of steam.
Between May and July 1978, we had the feeling that things were fizzling out. Then the imperial family left for a vacation by the Caspian Sea. A summer torpor had settled over the country. There was no insurgency in the air.
During this period, religious activists regularly attacked symbols of westernization such as department stores, banks and cinemas. It was in this context that on August the 19th, 1978, the Rex cinema in the industrial city of Abadan was deliberately burned down. 477 victims, the majority of them women and children, perished in the blaze. The cinema doors had been locked from the outside. Feelings were running high and rumors began to spread about the identity of those responsible for the attack.
Dans une société fermée, dans un état autoritaire,
in this closed society, an authoritarian state, every suspicious death, every strange occurrence was blamed on the very dangerous, well-equipped and authoritarian secret police force, known as SAVAK.
Le premier accusé, c'est la SAVAK.
That's why people always said, it's SAVAK, it's SAVAK, it's SAVAK. They were the sworn enemy of 90% of the population. That's how it was.
First there was the inquiry, which was soon wrapped up. All we knew was how many victims there had been. Nothing was done. Flags were flown at half-mast, but it needed the king, or at least the queen, who was better at that sort of thing, to attend the funerals. The government should have organized a religious ceremony in Tehran at one of the great mosques. But nothing was done. The press were told to report it as a minor incident.
The outcry provoked by the cinema fire united all the opponents of the regime. Within 2 weeks, the uprising had reached Tehran. It matters little that some wished to establish Kingdom of God, while others dreamt of democracy. The extreme left, communists, liberals, social democrats and ordinary citizens all supported the efforts of the religious ideologists to drive out the Shah of Iran. It is now thought that the attack was carried out by activists close to Ayatollah Khomeini. Poland, the Lenin shipyards, Gdansk, August 1980. The dismissal of a worker who was campaigning for the legalization of free trade unions has triggered a mass strike that had been going on for 10 days. The workers are implementing a strategy that has never before been attempted in the history of uprisings, a strategy aimed at sparing them this. The indignity of being crushed by Soviet tanks, the ultimate fate of the 1968 protests in Prague.
The possibility of an intervention was there, and we were all aware of it. The strike could very well have ended in a bloodbath.
The idea was simple: restrict the revolt to civil society. Demand the right of workers to organize themselves freely within the factories without challenging the power of the Communist Party.
We were aware that by locking ourselves in, by organizing a strike and a sit-in, we were putting the ruling power in a difficult situation. When you take to the streets, as we did in 1976 in Warsaw, the government can react and send in the police or the army to open fire on the demonstrators.
The strategy was a delicate balancing act, and its success relied on maintaining absolute control of developments. To avoid the interventions of Warsaw Pact armed forces, the revolt had to be contained within the factories. Demands had to fall within strict guidelines, and street demonstrations had to be avoided at all costs. On August the 23rd, Polish Deputy Prime Minister Jagiellonski, one of the country's highest-ranking representatives, was forced into negotiations with the strike committee, which represented 370 local companies and 400,000 wage earners. As the workers had prevented any of the deputation's vehicles from entering the site, the Deputy Prime Minister suffered the indignity of having to walk a gamut of striking workers on his way to the negotiating table. The tense negotiations between Jagiellonski and workers' representative Lech Walesa got underway, with the eyes of the world fixed on Gdansk. The stakes were high: the right to create the first free labor union in the whole of Eastern Europe. After a week of negotiations, the workers won a huge victory. Initially, the right to create free labor unions was granted only for the region of Gdansk. But for the whole of Poland, the decision opened up a new world of possibilities.
Niezależne, samorządne związki zawodowe.
Pierwszy etap wygrany, ale drugi dużo cięższy. Oj, ciężki, ja się bardzo go boję. Na pewno będą potknięcia, na pewno będzie ktoś chciał nas trochę wyprowadzić w manowce. Taka jest prawda. Ale my się nie damy, bo wszyscy bierzemy odpowiedzialność. Nie ja sam, ale wszyscy razem to jest siła, to jest moc i my to zrobimy.
These people were living under the yoke of a conformist regime. But they suddenly felt a sense of freedom, inasmuch as they felt entitled to express themselves, entitled to a say in what was going on, and they believed in the collective freedom to act.
Obviously, this great movement, solidarity, had sprung up all over the country. Up and down the land, the people who had created solidarity wanted to have their success. They wanted to repeat the success of Gdansk. In a way, it's what this revolution demanded.
This union brought together the new independent trade unions now flourishing in Poland, in all sectors of the economy all over the land. The Solidarity revolt quickly escalated, spreading far and wide, and yet it remained compartmentalized and restricted to factories. Starting in Gdansk, within 3 months, 10 million of Poland's 13 million wage earners had become members of Solidarity. By organizing themselves and strictly limiting the scope of their demands, the Polish workers had forced a dictatorship to its knees with zero bloodshed. From that point on, the Solidarity movement seemed unstoppable. Tunisia, December 2010. The immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi, a Sidi Bouzid street vendor, has triggered a revolt that has quickly spread to the adjoining neighborhoods. Young people are attacking symbols of power, particularly police stations. The police respond by opening fire using live ammunition. Predictably, lives are lost.
The wave of protest spread from one police station to the next like a wildfire.
Lawyers, human rights activists, as well as members of Tunisia's principal trade union, the UGTT, with at least 500,000 members, attempted to both fan the flames and supervise the protests. While an anti-authoritarian tradition prevailed at grassroots level, the trade union's national leaders were indisputably in bed with the government. Their general secretary, Abdesalem Gerard, a charismatic figure recognized throughout Tunisia, even officially endorsed the candidacy of Ben Ali in 2009. December the 25th, 2010 in Tunis, a first meeting is organized outside UGTT headquarters.
People looked at us and were baffled. We might as well have been extraterrestrials. No one dared chant slogans against Ben Ali in the street. So people were kind of shocked and afraid.
La première période était
The early stages were difficult because people were still very much afraid. They were even scared to go on Facebook in case they were being monitored. I remember the early periods, say the 17th or the 18th, right up till late December. Videos were still being watched. I didn't participate. It's important to stress that because the fear was still there.
December the 28th, 2010. While the bloody riots continue in the provinces, Ben Ali is at the bedside of Mohamed Bouazizi. He then received Bouazizi's mother and sister, and as his habit, he offers financial compensation. Through these two acts of communication, Ben Ali is hoping to calm things down. But in the following days, the uprising will, on the contrary, cross several critical thresholds. January the 3rd, a riot in the city of Tala, where 250 people are attacking the ruling party's HQ, quickly degenerates. On January the 6th, all the lawyers in the country come out and strike. On January the 8th, a second person sets fire to themselves in Sidi Bouzid. On January the 8th and 9th, at least 23 people are shot dead in the country. The unrest crosses another new threshold on January the 12th, when the UGTT organizes the first mass strike in Sfax, the country's economic capital.
The demonstration held on the 12th in Sfax was unprecedented in Tunisia's history. Estimates vary, but it was attended between 60,000 and 100,000 people.
It was an impressive strike. Some think that it was the strike that destabilized Ben Ali.
While the huge success of the Sfax strike helped destabilize the regime, it was the words of the UGTT regional secretary that really hit hard that day.
واحنا منضمين مع اخواننا المحامين اللي بعيدوا للعنف كذلك الحكوميين والممثلين وكل من تعرض للعنف من طرف البوليس سنحميهم وسنتضامن معهم باش ما يبقاش في ظلم ومكان ما يبقاش رصاص واذا اطلق الرصاص من جديد سنخلق قرارات اخرى خذوها مسلمه من الاتحاد الشيعي.
The UGTT leader had just put an end to the collusion between his trade union and the ruling powers. This was a complete turnaround, and it was perceived as such the length and breadth of Tunisia.
The 12th was a turning point at grassroots level, in people's minds.
For the first time since the beginning of the protests, a general strike was scheduled in Tunis for Friday, January the 14th, 2011. The day before the strike, Ben Ali made a televised speech in a style that disconcerted all Tunisians. In the hope of getting closer to his people, he did not address them as was the custom in literary Arabic.
Ce soir-là,
that evening, he spoke in Tunisian dialect.
Le dialecte tunisien.
أكلمكم بلغة كل التونسيين والتونسيات. أكلمكم الآن لأن الوضع يفرض تغيير عميق. نعم، تغيير عميق وشامل. وأنا فهمتكم. نعم، أنا فهمتكم. فكفاء عنفا. الكرتوش مش مقبول، ما عندوش مبرر إلا لا قدر الله حد يحاول يفك سلاحك.
Quand j'ai remarqué qu'il a changé de ton, moi j'ai eu peur.
When I realized he had changed his tone, I was afraid because I thought the Tunisians would be taken in.
Même avant qu'il ne finisse
Before he had finished, the RCD people, his supporters, were already in the street tooting their horns.
En train de klaxonner.
Location. Osman, Hassan. 5 كلاب location بعضهم يزمروا حسين.
This Tunisian is finding out that the chorus of klaxon is not spontaneous. This outpouring of popular joy has been staged by the ruling powers.
Et c'était un coup orchestré parce que ça se voyait.
It had to be a setup. It was plain as day. People were out on the street before he'd finished his speech. It wasn't even in sync with the scheduled broadcast. You can't celebrate good news without knowing what it is. They were out celebrating before they even knew what he was saying. So we all knew, and we were angry. From an emotional point of view, I was in a rage. I'd never felt such anger.
Surdimensionné, mais après
Then I thought we'd better calm down because he was still speaking.
Encore en train de parler. Et puis il n'était pas du tout synchronisé.
Everything was out of sync.
Moi, dans mon quartier,
in my neighborhood, while he was calling for a ceasefire, a couple of streets away, they were still firing. There was a communication breakdown. Something wasn't right.
Ils sont en train de tomber là. Il y a quelque chose qui va mal.
Ben Ali's promises and the crude attempts of the ruling power failed to curb the protests. On January the 14th, even people who'd never before demonstrated decided to take the plunge.
I remember joining the demonstration near Tunis Cathedral. And I began to walk as the crowd was swelling. I couldn't shout at first. My throat was too tight. And not until I was beyond the theatre, maybe 200 or 300 meters further along, was I able to yell anything. Once we reached the ministry building, it all kicked off and we were shouting for hours.
On est libre! On est libre! On est libre! Filmez-nous! On n'a pas peur! On n'a pas peur! Bas le terreur! Bas le dictateur!
With the mass protest outside the Ministry of the Interior, which was also a torture centre and the most feared place in all Tunisia, the revolt crossed a new threshold. Among the crowd of demonstrators were lawyers, UGTT union activists, unemployed youths, as well as company directors, the non-political, Islamists and communists. In other words, the whole of Tunisian society. Thus did a revolt in Sidi Bouzid, a modest provincial city, escalate, spreading within weeks throughout the length and breadth of Tunisia.
Pour passer d'une dictature à une démocratie, il faut une période difficile, il faut du sang. Il y a eu 90 morts à peu près, il y a eu au moins 1000 blessés, au moins qu'ils ne soient pas morts et blessés pour rien.
Rebellion is always a costly and dangerous act, which is why the escalation of unrest throughout a society is neither predictable nor systematic. In fact, it is an exceptional phenomenon. Revolt always escalates in the wake of unforeseen and sudden events that change the perception of other players in other areas of society. Those who join a revolt are latching onto a protest begun by others. They see a sudden opportunity to take action of their own. They have their own agenda and they make their own demands. And that's how unrest can relocate and escalate. The ruling power, which initially reacts in the usual way, is soon forced to try something else in the hope of putting an end to the uprising. In France, the escalation of the unrest took on extraordinary proportions. Only the police force and senior civil servants seemed unaffected by the protests. May the 24th, 1968, the head of state prepares to speak for the first time since the beginning of the unrest.
La crise de l'université, crise provoquée par l'impuissance de ce grand corps à s'adapter aux nécessités modernes de la nation. Si par un oui massif, vous m'exprimez votre confiance, j'entreprendrai avec les pouvoirs publics, et je l'espère, le concours de tous ceux qui veulent servir l'intérêt commun.
Il a dit n'importe quoi! Il a dit n'importe quoi! Il a dit...
As a solution to the crisis, the general offered a referendum on a fuzzy issue that was completely out of step with the reality of the situation.
There was a second night of riots. They tried to storm the Hôtel de Ville in Paris. They tried to storm the stock exchange. They even set fire to it. The protesters and the police clashed all night long.
One dead, 500 injured, 800 arrests. The violence of the public's response to the head of state's intervention was not, however, the most remarkable phenomenon. Astonishingly, the president's orders, which usually represent the absolute authority of the state apparatus, were quite simply not implemented by the ministers concerned. This wait-and-see attitude in the corridors of power had spread to all levels of government.
People were no longer obeying orders. They didn't contest them, they just said, very well, and then did nothing.
In France, the lines of responsibility in government were crumbling as the state apparatus began to break down. In China in 1989, government was a collegiate body. Li Peng, the Prime Minister. Deng Xiaoping, former General Secretary of the Communist Party, now President of the Central Military Commission. And Zhao Ziyang, General Secretary of the Communist Party. While Deng Xiaoping and Li Peng advocated a firm response to the uprising, Zhao Ziyang had admitted as early as May the 4th that the student demands had some legitimacy.
We sensed the divisions in the government. In a speech Zhao Ziyang gave on May the 4th, while receiving foreign visitors, It was published in the newspaper. In other words, the Communist Party had reformists on one side and conservatives on the other. This was important, even if they were just posturing.
May the 16th, when Zhou Ziyang met Gorbachev in Beijing, he blamed the protests on Deng Xiaoping. Deng and Li Peng were livid. Zhou Ziyang had broken ranks in the presence of a foreigner, and the following day, the demonstrators rubbed salt in the wound by aiming their slogans directly at Deng Xiaoping. Just as a rift seemed to have appeared in China's government, something else happened. On May the 18th, Prime Minister Li Peng summoned the student leaders to the Great Hall of the People to issue a public reprimand, while some of the hunger strikers, such as Wu Kaixi, had only just been discharged from hospital.
I remember that opening speech well. I was sitting in the front row. Wang Dan was right beside me. We looked at each other and said, he has to be interrupted.
现在解决问题的关键并不是说服我们在座的这些人，问题在于怎么去让他们离开，他们离开的条件我已经说得很清楚了。刚才他们离开这里的条件我已经说得很清楚了，只有这一种可能性，这是客观现实、客观事实。我们如果广场上有一个人不离开，还在继续绝食的话，我们就很难保证剩下的几千人不离开。
And the government didn't order the broadcaster to cut it. That scene was broadcast throughout China and all over the world.
That a student should publicly reprimand the Chinese Prime Minister was in itself astonishing. More astonishing still, however, is the fact that the recorded program was broadcast that very same evening on television. Either the censor's orders had been issued and not carried out, or worse still, the order had not even been given. It offers clear proof of how a ruling power can misjudge a situation that seems so straightforward. The state apparatus was beginning to show signs of instability. Iran, August the 27th, 1978. After the Abadan cinema tragedy, the Shah appointed Jafar Sharif Imami as the new Prime Minister. Here is presenting his new government. For the first time, as a gesture of appeasement, he decided to allow a demonstration on September the 7th. Not only was this demonstration a huge success, the slogan Islamic Republic was chanted for the first time. In response, the Shah banned any public gatherings and proclaimed martial law on the night of the 7th to the 8th of September 1978.
La loi martiale est déclarée.
Martial law was declared. The army entered the fray, and General Oveisi was appointed Tehran's military governor.
Le bruit court.
Right afterwards, rumors began to circulate that a demonstration was planned for Jaleh Square, in the center of Tehran, not far from the National Assembly. Military Governor General Oveisi immediately issued a communiqué declaring a ban on any gathering of more than 2 people.
On September the 8th, 5,000 hardcore protesters decided to oppose the ban. The army duly reacted, and repression turned to massacre. Around 200 demonstrators were killed, but with feelings running so high at the time, unofficial estimates ran into the thousands.
The corpses were kept on ice because families were afraid that if they were given over to funeral services, SAVAK would be able to identify the victims and persecute their relatives.
The baffling policy of the ruling power alternating concession and repression was the direct reason behind the Iranian army's terrible blunder. It was also a symptom of the profound confusion that prevailed within the state of Iran. In Poland, the Solidarity protests had aggravated the country's financial standing, which was now on the brink of collapse. But there was even worse news for the ruling powers. Within a few months, a quarter of Communist Party members, that's to say 700,000 people, had joined Solidarity.
So these people began organizing themselves, trying to reform the Communist Party from within. That was a big problem for us, because we knew very well that the Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia began when the Soviets realized that the Communist Party and its structures were being dismantled from within.
This was the background to Defense Minister General Jaruzelski's appointment as Prime Minister on February the 10th, 1981. Jaruzelski immediately suspended the right to demonstrate for a period of 2 months while the country's financial crisis was addressed. But when he asked Parliament for ratification, in what should have been a mere formality, he had to threaten to resign before obtaining it. A few months earlier, such a wrangle with MPs would have been unthinkable.
Parliament predated the creation of Solidarity and was supposed to be totally obedient to the Communist Party. But it revolted.
The fact that divisions within the habitually monolithic parliament were now paralyzing government was a sign that the Polish state was beginning to fall apart. Tunisia, December the 28th, 2010. Ben Ali is giving his first televised speech in response to the events of Sidi Bouzid.
ونتقبل التحديات التي يطرحها علينا لتشغيل هذه النسبة المرتفعة من حامل الشهادات عندما نطالب بالشغل وذلك.
Suddenly, the dictator's telephone begins to ring.
ورغم الصعوبات التي يطرحها هذا النوع المستجد من البطالة فإنه يبقى مصدرا للتفاؤل بالمستقبل. تفاؤل شعب متعلم يثابر من أجل الرقي ومزيد التقدم.
The dictator's solemn appearance live on television was transformed into tragic comedy.
مبدأ وأسلوبا للتعامل بين سائر الأطراف الوطنية والاجتماعية حول القضايا والمستجدات.
Not only did the impromptu ringing drown out Ben Ali's words, it revealed to all Tunisians the confusion that now reigned in the upper echelons of power. And it didn't stop there.
My father was commander of the National Guard under Ben Ali.
In Tunisia, law and order are maintained by the police in urban areas and by the National Guard in rural zones.
All those concerned held a meeting to discuss ways of handling the crisis. One suggestion was to swap uniforms and dress the police in the uniform of the National Guard because the people still held them in high regard.
The idea of dressing up the police as National Guardsmen revealed the disarray in which the forces of law and order had descended. But there was more. On December the 31st, the commander of the National Guard took the initiative of issuing the following order. The use of gas or firearms is strictly forbidden under any circumstances, whatever the level of confrontation. By this order, which applied to 80% of Tunisian territory, the commander of the National Guard was dissociating himself from the ruling power.
It was a dangerous move. He didn't have permission from either Ben Ali or the Interior Minister.
While the order was applied in certain areas, it certainly wasn't in others. The directive failed to prevent further blunders and fatal shootings.
No one knew what was going on. who was giving orders or what kind of orders could be given. I'd never seen my father like that before. He had a great deal of charisma. He wasn't easily rattled. I'd seen him in all kinds of situations. I could see he was very agitated and overwhelmed by what was going on, as were the other leaders.
Now escalating out of control, the unrest was continuing to undermine the state apparatus. Collusion among the ruling elite was disintegrating, and the cracks were starting to appear in public, even among the apparently monolithic power bases. From top to bottom of the state hierarchy, civil servants were acting more and more according to their own personal agenda, driven by their own doubts, fears, and sense of opportunity. In this situation, responses vary according to the individual, which is why certain obvious orders are not given, while others are never passed on or applied. It's also why some stand idly by while others take highly unusual personal initiatives. The upshot is, the levers of power break down while the unrest enters a new phase. In France, the communists and trade unions colluded with the government in an attempt to claw back control of the protests. In China, the people of Beijing blocked the military convoys sent in to clear Tiananmen Square. In Iran, soldiers began to desert the increasingly overwhelmed army in droves. In Poland, Walesa and the Solidarity chief struggled to contain the wildcat strikes breaking out all over the country. In Tunis, the army lined up outside official buildings, while ostensibly maintaining its neutrality. And in every case, the developments continued to propel the country into complete chaos.